Converging Media, A New Introduction to Mass Communication, 5th edition, Chapter 8, Journalism from Information to Participation, Part 1. Chapter 8 gives students an idea of the challenges of journalistic practices in the 21st century and what reporters are expected to know about the world they are covering. Multimedia reporting has become the norm in the newsroom. Students will also learn about other codes and conventions in journalism from other countries. After reading this chapter, you should be able to do the following. Describe journalism and its role in mass communication in society. Outline important historical developments in journalism that affect how it is practiced today. Discuss journalism today, including different types and the effects of convergence. Outline legal and ethical issues in the practice of journalism, particularly ethical issues in the digital world. Explain some aspects of the business of journalism and how they affect the practice of journalism. And finally, examine how convergence is affecting business models and careers in journalism. So what is news? Reporting covers the unexpected in society, but most news stories are predictable and follow a certain representational professional code. There are also stories that are seasonal, like fashion during the Academy Awards, holiday shopping, new movie releases, etc. Many of these stories are covered because they affect the public. Fires, accidents, crimes, recent discoveries, corporate and political corruption events, and obituaries, to just name a few. One of the frequent criticisms of news is the negative nature of many of the stories, especially when it comes to crime coverage. Historian and Pulitzer Prize-winning author Daniel Boorstin describes what he calls pseudo-events, which are press conferences and other stage events like marches and rallies, as an example of how groups can influence news coverage. Agenda setting, then, occurs when journalists use their coverage to influence what their audience deems important and what is therefore more likely to be discussed. In terms of the amount of space devoted to each type of content, most newspapers and magazines are actually more advertising the news, and I'm sure you all have seen that consistently. So the historical development of journalism. In the 19th century, journalism changed dramatically because newspapers had to hire reporters and staff to cover events and pursue stories. News was organized in chronological order, independent of importance. The penny press needed to attract readers, and so publishers shifted their focus to sensational crimes and events. To distinguish opinion from news, editorials were launched. One of the first newspaper founders, James Gordon Bennett, who started the New York Herald in 1835, also introduced a financial page and public affairs reporting, which became staples of modern journalism. Minority newspapers, which we call dissident voices, they helped to create the early alternative press because typically minorities, people of color, were not able to contribute or were not even known to be able to read and write, let alone write compelling stories. So people like Frederick Douglass and Ida B. Wells helped to kind of voice what was going on in the African American life, as well as within the larger landscape of society at that time. And this helped to create a more nuanced and balanced alternative perspective to the mainstream coverage, which was predominantly male and predominantly white. News values in the Associated Press. A news outlet that is credited with one of the highest standards in journalism is the Associated Press, AP, which employs about 3,200 people in over 280 locations worldwide. The AP has already received 50 Pulitzer Prizes, including 30 for photos. The AP embraces 4 journalistic values, and they are truth in reporting, accuracy in reporting, integrity, and ethics. And if you ever have to take a journalism or a news writing class, you will often have to use a book called the AP Style Book, which basically is what journalists within any type of journalism field use when they are writing their stories, when they are crafting their stories and referring to different events dependent on their value within society. Pulitzer and Hearst, the circulation wars, sensationalism, and standards. Despite the AP's high standards in reporting, the most widespread newspaper model in the 19th and early 20th centuries was sensational journalism. Two of the newspaper titans of the era were William Randolph Hearst publisher of the San Francisco Examiner and the New York Journal, and Joseph Pulitzer, publisher of the New York World and St. Louis Post-Dispatch and other papers. Joseph Pulitzer was Hungarian and immigrated to the U.S. in 1864. In 1878, he purchased his first of several papers. In the 1890s, Pulitzer and Hearst were fierce competitors in the so-called circulation wars. The term yellow journalism was coined to describe the sensational style of the Pulitzer and Hearst newspapers. And we often find that yellow journalism is very similar to what we find in the Inquirer or some of our more lighthearted magazines or periodicals that kind of just focus on things that aren't that serious, but that people are really interested in. So a lot of drama, things that may be somewhat truthful but not completely truthful. William Randolph Hearst profited from the wealth of his father, who was a self-made multimillionaire. At only 23 years of age, Hearst became the proprietor of his newspaper, the San Francisco Examiner, and in 1895, the New York Morning Journal became his second acquisition, and the Evening Journal followed shortly afterward. The rise of electronic journalism. The era of electronic journalism began when radio became a medium of mass communication in the 1920s, and the golden age of newspapers started to decline. So television then came and further contributed to the decline of newspapers and influence and readership, which we still see today. How many of us actually read a physical newspaper with news copy or newsprint versus reading our news online or getting it from a source that may be online specifically or broadcasted? The era of electronic journalism began when radio became a medium of mass communication. So when we think about electronic journalism, we want to consider that these impacted how we view the news, how we access the news, and how the news was organized. So Edward R. Murrow first achieved fame by broadcasting dramatic radio news reports from London during World War II, but he is best known for his quality TV journalism in the late 1940s and early 1950s. Electronic news gathering, also called E&G, changed how news was gathered, how fast it was delivered, and how it was presented. The tools of E&G include video cameras and satellite dishes, and as you've read or when you read, and as we'll talk later on, you'll see that some of this has been enhanced by more mobile devices and mobile ways of gathering and distributing news. The rise of the 24-hour news channel means that there is much more of a news hole to fill, which encourages stations to be less discriminating about what they consider newsworthy. However, much of the material in the 24-hour news cycle is entertainment or promotional in nature, and depending on the news circuit that you follow or the syndicates, you'll find that people will basically have the same story, but they will take a different take on it. They will have a different positionality on it. Additionally, as we consider the foundations of journalism, we want to remember that digital technology and the internet continue to transform journalism, although some facets of professional mainstream journalism will not change, such as the way that reporters interview people. So the Hutchins Commission and a free and responsible press. This is a 133-page report of the Commission on Freedom of the American Press written by Robert Maynard Hutchins in 1947, where he argued that the public has a right to information that affects it and that the press has a responsibility to present that information. The report was then called a free and responsible press. So key recommendations here are that the government should give all media the same constitutional guarantees traditionally enjoyed only by print media. Secondly, that agencies of mass comm assume the responsibility of financing new experimental activities in their field. And then thirdly, that the public should create academic professional centers of advanced study, research, and publication in the field of communication. Secondly, the separation of editorial and business operations. People often call this a separation of the church and state in newsroom parlance. And so this was important because oftentimes a lot of what people did was tied to not only the way that they reported, but how they did business. And this obviously, counteracted objectivity and created a myriad of issues and not being able to offer fair and balanced reporting. So the basic principle of news coverage is news should not be influenced by business decisions and advertisers. That's not to say that it's not, because in some ways it definitely is, but that there was a standard that everybody agreed on and that people try to achieve, whether they do so successfully or not. Fairness and balance in news coverage. So the goals of fairness and balance in news coverage have replaced the long-held but unattainable goal of objectivity in journalism. Because let's be clear, it's really hard to be objective if something impacts you or you have a lived experience. So when we talk about fairness and balance, what we mean are the following. Fairness involves covering all relevant sides of an issue. So if you think about an argument, you have an argument or you hear about an argument with someone, they're oftentimes telling you their side and maybe not potentially trying to tell other parts or leave out other parts, but they're taking it from their own positionality. So making sure that as a journalist, you're keeping up with what's going on and you're telling all sides of an issue. Balance involves presenting sides equally or reporting on a broad range of news events. And then finally, factors such as the relative importance of a voice within the context of the story and the validity or authority of the news source must be considered. Framing the news. Framing, we talked about this throughout this text, and we will continue to talk about this for the remainder of the semester. In this text, it means, or in this context, it means putting the facts of a story into a frame or angle so that nuances in the story are either ignored or made or seen unimportant. We see this all of the time. And hopefully through learning in this class, you'll be able to kind of point this out more, especially using your media literacy skill set. International perspective. So one area that's really important for journalism and that has impacted journalism considerably is how we cover Islam or how we cover those of Islamic faith. Framing of news events since 9/11, unfortunately, has impacted the way that people have dealt with such issues as Islamophobia and racial disparities and religion. So the U.S. media have depicted Islam as monolithic, which is extremely problematic because if you know anything about Islam, that's not the case. Just like if you were to say that all African Americans are the same or all whites are the same. You know, you cannot categorize a group of people as being monolithic or as being the same because we potentially are just not. We definitely are not. And then scholar Edward Said criticizes the inaccurate depiction of Islam in his text covering Islam. So when we think about how this impacts journalism and how this impacts what we do as journalists, we have to be considerate about what it means to be fair and balanced. You know, should you be reporting on something if you feel that strongly about it? Will you have a bias and will that impact the audience and the readers of your stories or of your content because you, in fact, are an opinion leader within that space? Okay, and then finally, expert sources. So we're all familiar with this young man where he was talking about hide your kids, hide your wife, because they be raping everybody up in her. So typically when we find expert sources, when they're expert sources of color, oftentimes they are people who we find to be very comical, to maybe be misinformed, or to be represented in a negative light. Usually, though, expert sources are used to give news more credibility because that's someone that's there to experience it. That's not to say that Antoine Dodson was not a credible source, but it was also found that he was exploited. And through this exploitation, he was able to get some money, but this did nothing for the community. And actually, if you kind of go back and look, some of the same things happened even after this report to these people in this community. So in this way, Antoine may have been a witness, but may not have been the best expert source. Studies show that many experts used tend to be white and male. Thus, expert voices of color rarely are featured. And when they are featured, they're usually people who we laugh at, the people who are made into memes. They're people who may just be there but may not know the whole story. And so it's often found that journalists are seen as being very exploitative of people of color or people who are disenfranchised. And that's something that we have to discontinue. Please stay tuned for part 2 of chapter 8.